Hey, Cypher here. What made the 13 colonies seek independence in 1776? What started the American Revolution? Any telling of the American Revolution really has to start with the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it was known throughout the rest of the world. This bloody conflict was begun over territorial disputes in the New World. It spread across Europe and ended with the British Empire annexing a great deal of the French lands in the New World, including Canada and the older colonies getting land that went all the way to the Mississippi. To prevent any more hostilities with Indians, a royal proclamation was drawn up in 1763, setting a western border to colonial advance. Colonists didn't like being hemmed in like this, and there was some protestation. Some people just flat out refused to acknowledge it, so they struck out on their own past the line. War also costs a lot of money. England had to recuperate its expenditures, so they started instituting heavy taxes on the colonies. This didn't go so well. The first tax was actually lowering a previous tax. The Sugar Act of 1764 reduced taxes on molasses by half, but added a heavy enforcement mechanism. The colonists had been smuggling sugar before that, so they continued to do so, but with more harassment from tax collectors. Then the Stamp Act, Currency Acts, and Quartering Acts were passed a year later. These acts imposed harsh taxes and burdens on the colonists. People saw this as a violation of their civil liberties as Englishmen, and it was heavily protested, even to the point of boycotting British goods. In Boston especially, all of this was organized by the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization formed for the sole purpose of fighting these taxes. There was even a Congress formed in New York that would be the predecessor to the later Continental Congresses. Parliament quickly repealed parts of these taxes, but with it came a declaration that they had all the same power to tax the colonists as people in England. Part of the protests had been to claim that colonists didn't have any representation in Parliament, so they could not be taxed so heavily. The crisis was averted for a few years, but the flames of rebellion were still smoldering, and the Sons of Liberty lived on. During this time in the southern colonies, people went into the wilderness to set up their own paramilitary government in opposition to British rule. From 1765 to 1771, these regulators, as they were called, created their own independent courts and fought against the British. This was an actual shooting war that involved basically an insurgency, and people died, but it was eventually quashed. Parliament tried to escalate the pressure as they steadily passed what is normally called the Townshend Acts. From 1767 to 1770, 5 acts were passed raising taxes steadily on various things. The colonies protested again, but not as fervently, since it was not a burst of taxation like a few years prior. Minor boycotts were imposed, and minor protests were organized. The Sons of Liberty in Boston were especially fervent, and one protest in Boston was squashed by British soldiers by firing into a crowd, resulting in 11 casualties. People called it the Boston Massacre, and it became the symbol of British oppression. Parliament held firm, though, and only repealed certain aspects of the acts. Parliament was ready for another round of this in 1773, and so they passed the Tea Act, designed to force everyone to drink tea from England. Boston protested by throwing the first import of the tea into the harbor. Well, Parliament didn't really like that so much. They imposed martial law on Massachusetts, blockaded her harbors, moved trials outside the colony, and quartered troops in people's houses. These laws were quickly called the Intolerable Acts because people were pissed off. The colonies erupted in protest again. A Continental Congress was formed with delegates from 13 colonies, and they passed a boycott of all British goods. It was extremely effective, but England did not have time to react, due to what was happening in Massachusetts. A common refrain throughout all of this was no taxation without representation, but it's a common misconception to think that the British did not have any taxes on the colonies before this. In fact, the colonies were taxed, just significantly less than Englishmen were elsewhere. All these taxes were to bring them to equal standing, and the colonists used that as their slogan for no taxation without representation. Rumors were flying in Massachusetts of bloodshed in the countryside in 1774. Some colonists began to think that war was on. The British were moving supplies around, so some folks raided the move and took control of gunpowder stores. Seditious people began gathering supplies and forming rebel militias in preparation for a possible war with the British over the Intolerable Acts. Tensions were rising, and the rebellion was already in existence, but nothing truly earth-shattering had happened yet. Then the British decided to raid a rebel store in Concord in the spring of 1775. Sources in London told of the raid before it had even reached the British in Massachusetts. Sons of Liberty riders were sent out to warn a network of rebels of the incoming raid. These men were set for battle within a minute, and quickly formed an imposing force. The first confrontation happened near Lexington at a bridge. No one knows who fired the first shot, but they skirmished and the British retreated. The Brits were harassed the entire way back by Minutemen, so they lost the initial conflict. With this victory, militias were formed to fight the British in Massachusetts. An initial campaign of what would become the American Revolutionary War began in the colony. While all this was happening, a Second Continental Congress was formed in the summer of 1775. They created a colonial army and put George Washington at its head. He rode out to organize the Boston Campaign. The war was on, and the Congress didn't know what to call it as yet. Some wanted independence, while others were fierce loyalists. The war escalated quickly. Washington had campaigns going throughout New England and into Canada. The beginning of the war was not very successful, and it kept getting worse. Congress needed to decide on what the war was all about before the decision was taken out of their hands. People had been publishing seditious material. One guy named Thomas Paine pushed the hardest. His pamphlet called Common Sense spurred Congress into action. They finally decided to declare independence from Britain on July 2nd, 1776. 2 days later, the signing of the Declaration of Independence began and were completed by mid-August. The declaration was sent to the printers and then to the British. Throughout this time, the British had made attempts at conciliatory measures and peaceable negotiation, but all failed. They quickly sent a negotiator to talk to some of the delegates in September, and again in 1778. But nothing came of the negotiations. They all failed miserably. The United States of America was set for a full-scale revolution. So what do you think was the main cause of the revolution? There isn't actually a clear answer, but leave a comment below and tell me what you think it was. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out some previous episodes while you're at it. I'll see you next time.